Have you ever judged someone based solely on their appearance? Have you ever looked at someone and thought they weren't worth your attention without knowing anything about them? But what if you were wrong? What if the man you just dismissed held a power beyond your imagination? What would you do if everything you believed about a person was suddenly turned upside down? This story will make you question your assumptions. Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more unexpected stories. Alexander drove his truck down the desolate road, the barren trees lining Route 66 standing like silent witnesses to his journey. The fading afternoon light filtered through the windshield, casting a glow over the scratches and dents on the truck's weathered exterior. There was something unsettling about this drive, like he was heading toward a place where the truth had never been spoken aloud. Then it appeared. Earl's Diner, a worn-down, faded relic of the past, standing alone in the emptiness. Nothing but silence. The rusted sign flickered against the evening sky, struggling to stay upright, almost as if it was protecting the secrets buried within. Strangers weren't welcome here. Alexander knew that the moment he pulled up. This was a place where time had stopped, where people knew only their own kind. Killing the engine, he didn't rush to get out. Instead, he sat for a moment, watching the suspicious glances thrown his way from inside. Through the window, he could see the eyes of the patrons, people who were used to things staying the same, people who weren't fond of outsiders. He wasn't one of them, and they knew it. The doorbell jingled as Alexander pushed open the diner's creaking entrance. The moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt colder. It wasn't the weather, it was them. The entire diner fell silent. Every conversation halted, every fork hovering midair, every pair of eyes turning toward him. Not with welcome, but with unspoken judgment. The unspoken question hung in the air. Why is he here? Alexander scanned the room. This wasn't just a diner. It was a territory, one where newcomers were measured, tested, and often discarded before they could even prove themselves. A group of bikers near the counter had been mid-conversation. Now they simply stared. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and tattooed arms, let out a slow, deliberate smirk. He leaned back, making sure his voice carried across the room. Look at that. A drifter with nothing to his name. What's he doing here? Laughter erupted around him. Sharp, dismissive. The kind of laughter meant to strip a man down before he could even sit. Alexander didn't react. He walked toward an empty table and lowered himself onto the worn-out seat. He didn't say a word. His silence rattled them. The longer he refused to engage, the more they pressed. They wanted him to break. They wanted him to feel small. But Alexander knew something they didn't. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words, and right now it was speaking volumes. He could feel them watching him, judging him, measuring him. And yet, he wondered, if I stood up, changed my clothes, if they saw me in a different light, would they treat me differently? Did a man's worth truly come down to appearances? He already knew the answer, and tonight, so would they. Gabriel, the leader of the cycling group, was the first to speak, his gaze sweeping over Alexander with thinly veiled disdain. A smirk curled on his lips as he took in the worn-out hoodie, the scuffed shoes, the faded clothes. Look at this, Gabriel sneered. A traveler? Here for lunch? Or just here to be the outsider? His voice dripped with mockery, and the others laughed, their voices bouncing off the walls of the diner like an unspoken warning. The tension thickened. Gabriel stepped closer, deliberately closing the space between them. A subtle power play. You do realize this place isn't meant for people like you, don't you? He added, his tone smooth but sharp, meant to wound, meant to push. All eyes were now on Alexander, waiting for a response. But he didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he took a slow, unbothered sip of his coffee, as if Gabriel's words hadn't even reached him. Silence. And for the first time that evening, it wasn't Alexander who looked unsettled. It was Gabriel. The tension in the diner grew heavier, yet Alexander remained unmoved. His patience was a strength, a kind of power that neither Gabriel nor his crew could understand. Gabriel's smirk faltered. Why isn't he reacting? Why isn't he fighting back? The absence of anger, of fear, of submission, it confused him. It unnerved him. And that uncertainty spread to the rest of the group. The bikers continued to stare, measuring him, searching for something to dismiss, but they found nothing. Gabriel, still holding on to his confidence, muttered another insult under his breath. But it landed on nothing, because Alexander was untouchable. He wasn't ignoring them out of weakness. He wasn't afraid. He simply didn't care. The longer Alexander remained silent, the more control he gained. He didn't have to prove anything. He simply was. A man enjoying his meal, untouched by the judgments of those who believed they held power over him. And in that silence, something shifted. The bikers' laughter died down. The mockery lost its weight. Gabriel's once dominant stance began to crack, because for the first time in his life, he had come across a man he couldn't shake. A man too steady, too self-assured, too solid to be moved by cheap words. The ridicule was gone now, replaced by something they hadn't expected to feel. Respect. Though no one said it aloud, they all felt it. And in that moment, they weren't just looking at a stranger in a hoodie anymore. They were looking at someone they would never forget. Gabriel stepped toward Alexander, each step echoing heavily against the diner floor, his boots striking the ground with an almost deliberate force, as if warning the entire room. His presence loomed like a shadow, a blatant display of dominance. He stopped just in front of Alexander, his eyes gleaming with mockery, and the thickness of his beard only added to the rugged arrogance that radiated from him. All eyes in the diner turned toward them, tension rising like an invisible tide, thickening the air. The group of bikers, seemingly anticipating this moment, began clapping lightly, a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if they were spectating a fight they were certain to win. But Alexander didn't move. He remained seated, calm, unaffected. Though his heartbeat may have quickened, he gave away nothing. His composure was unnerving. Gabriel was used to people reacting with anger or nervousness, but Alexander did neither. The weight of Gabriel's words only intensified the tension, yet Alexander showed no fear, no hesitation. Instead, he offered a small, knowing smile. Not one of defiance, but of quiet confidence, as if the entire situation was nothing more than a trivial moment in his day. "Can you say something worth listening to?" Alexander finally responded, his voice steady, smooth yet sharp enough to slice through the thick atmosphere of the room. Gabriel hesitated, his lips parted as if to snap back, but no words came. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face, the kind that only comes when someone realizes their grip on control is slipping. The bikers, who moments ago had been entertained, began to sense a shift in the air. What had started as a power play was quickly turning into something else, something Gabriel hadn't prepared for. Silence fell, and in that silence, it became clear. This wasn't just a test for Alexander. It was a test for everyone watching. Strength wasn't always about volume, about force. Sometimes it was about restraint. Gabriel stood taller, his boots tapping against the floor as he closed the distance between them. The silence in the diner was suffocating, broken only by the faint creak of chairs and the shallow breaths of onlookers. He locked eyes with Alexander, his expression hardening. "Leave," Gabriel ordered, his voice low but carrying an undeniable weight. "Now!" The diner shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Darius, though unfamiliar with the full extent of the situation, could feel the tension mounting. Plates, cups, and silverware remained untouched, as if even the objects in the room were holding their breath. Alexander, still composed, lifted his coffee cup and took a slow sip. Not rushed, not shaken. He then set it down gently and met Gabriel's glare with unwavering confidence. "Isn't this place open to everyone?" His words weren't a challenge, but a simple, undeniable truth. Gabriel stiffened. He hadn't expected that response. To him, Alexander was just an outsider, a man who had no place here. But now, with all eyes on them, that belief was unraveling. The tension in the room thickened. Gabriel's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. Yet he hesitated. He had no justification for forcing Alexander out. No real reason beyond pride. And that realization, however small, lingered. A long, heavy pause stretched between them. And then, As if acknowledging an unspoken truth, Gabriel took a step back. He turned, his boots striking against the floor as he walked away, his back rigid with frustration. Alexander remained seated. He hadn't needed to shout. He hadn't needed to fight. His presence alone had been enough. The tension in the room did not fully dissolve. Gabriel's frustration still simmered beneath the surface. This wasn't over. Not yet. The question remained. Would he let it go, or would his pride demand a second confrontation? Alexander sat firmly in his booth, his hands resting on the table, showing no signs of fear or hesitation. The diner seemed to be holding its breath, anticipating what would come next. Gabriel stood there, his eyes filled with challenge, locked onto Alexander. The tension between them was almost tangible, like a rope stretched too tight, with each man standing on either end, neither willing to be the first to back down. "Explain," Alexander said, his voice calm yet unyielding. "Why am I being treated this way?" Gabriel hesitated for just a fraction of a second, as if the question had struck deeper than he expected. His eyes flickered with a brief glint of surprise. He hadn't anticipated that the man sitting in front of him would confront his provocation with such quiet strength. A battle without words began in that moment, and the onlookers around them began to realize that this wasn't an ordinary confrontation. Gabriel wanted to respond, to release the anger boiling inside him, but something in Alexander's gaze made him pause. It wasn't hostility, it was something deeper, a silent challenge, a demand for truth. The silence stretched, but it wasn't Alexander who was hesitating. It was Gabriel. He swallowed hard, a faint unease creeping into his chest. The eyes of the diner remained fixed on them, no one daring to move. The space had transformed into an unspoken battlefield, and all it had taken was a simple question from Alexander to shift the entire dynamic. Now the tension was heavier than ever. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a challenge to Gabriel's own self-perception, and whatever answer he gave, if he even had one, would determine everything. But Alexander didn't wait for an answer. He had already said all he needed to with the sheer force of his composure. "So," Alexander continued, his voice steady, "are you judging me simply by my appearance?" The entire diner seemed to freeze. Gabriel stared into Alexander's unwavering eyes and realized that this wasn't just about their immediate confrontation. It was about respect. The air in the diner had become suffocatingly still. Every pair of eyes was locked onto the two men. Gabriel, full of confidence and aggression, now faced something he hadn't prepared for. There was something unsettling about Alexander's presence. His calmness wasn't weakness. It was power. It was control. Alexander's words weren't rushed, weren't careless. Every movement he made was deliberate, every word carefully chosen. He wasn't just facing Gabriel physically, he was confronting him on a much deeper level. To everyone else in the room, Alexander might have seemed like just another man. But Gabriel now understood that his silence, his stillness, carried a weight that was far more dangerous than any loud retort or physical display of dominance. As Alexander's gaze remained steady, something in Gabriel shifted. The confidence he had walked in with wasn't as solid as before. The way he had carried himself, expecting intimidation to be his greatest weapon, was now being turned back on him. Gabriel blinked, an uneasy feeling settling in his gut. Had he been wrong? Had he misjudged this man? The thought nagged at him, though he wasn't ready to admit it yet. This wasn't just about Alexander. It was about Gabriel himself. Had he really reduced a person to nothing more than a first impression? The silence was unbearable. The stillness was suffocating. Gabriel felt like he was being pushed into unfamiliar territory, one where brute strength and bravado weren't the currency that mattered, and that terrified him more than anything, because for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was the one in control. Gabriel stared at Alexander, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his heart tightening in his chest. Throughout this entire confrontation, he couldn't understand why a man like Alexander could sit there, completely calm, while he, someone who had always relied on strength and confidence, felt as though his world was unraveling. Then, without a word, Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow over his face, creating a shadow that flickered across Gabriel's uncertain eyes. With deliberate slowness, Alexander opened an article, and slid the phone across the table. Gabriel hesitated before glancing down. Bold letters jumped out at him. Alexander, renowned billionaire and philanthropist, a man who has changed countless lives. It was a gut punch. Gabriel felt the words sink in, each sentence hammering at the fragile foundation of his assumptions. The man he had dismissed as a worthless outsider was, in fact, someone whose influence stretched far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The article wasn't just a testament to Alexander's wealth. It was a recognition of his impact. Charitable foundations, community development projects, countless lives uplifted through his work. Gabriel stood frozen, his throat tightening with shame. He had misjudged Alexander entirely, reducing him to nothing more than a first impression, failing to recognize the strength and integrity he carried beneath the surface. The challenge in Gabriel's gaze faded, replaced by something he wasn't accustomed to feeling: humility. It wasn't just about Alexander. It was about Gabriel himself. He had allowed arrogance and superficial judgment to shape his actions. And now, in the piercing silence of the diner, he saw his own reflection in a way he never had before. The realization was suffocating. Every insult, every mocking smirk, every assumption he had made, they all felt like deep wounds carved into his own ego. The bikers around him, who had once fueled his bravado, were now silent witnesses to his reckoning. The tension in the room had shifted, no longer a spectacle of dominance, but an uncomfortable confrontation with truth. Their gazes, once filled with amusement, now carried something else: a newfound respect for Alexander, and an unsettling realization about Gabriel. Alexander had never needed to raise his voice, never needed to assert his authority through aggression. Instead, he had simply been calm, composed, and in complete control. That was his strength, and it was a strength that had completely dismantled Gabriel without ever throwing a single punch. Gabriel swallowed hard. His shoulders sagged ever so slightly, the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. He didn't know what to say. Would anyone ever look at him the same way again? Had he lost more than just an argument? Alexander didn't gloat. He didn't smirk in victory. He simply picked up his phone, placed it back in his pocket, and looked at Gabriel with the same steady, unshaken gaze. Because this had never been about proving superiority. It had been about proving a point. One that Gabriel would never forget. Finally, unable to hold on to his pride any longer, Gabriel lowered his head, a silent acknowledgement of the mistake he had made. The lesson had been learned, a deep, humbling lesson about judgment, respect, and the power of quiet resilience. As Alexander stood and walked out of the diner, he left behind no words, no parting remarks, just a profound silence that would linger in the minds of everyone present. It was the kind of silence that marked change, the kind that made people think. And for Gabriel, it was the beginning of a transformation he never saw coming. A lesson in perception. This story serves as a powerful reminder that judging others based on appearances alone is a grave mistake. True respect and strength don't come from physical dominance or loud words, but from wisdom, patience, and quiet confidence. Alexander never needed to boast about his achievements or demand respect. His mere presence and the way he handled confrontation spoke louder than any declaration of power. Gabriel, like many of us, fell into the trap of superficial judgment. His assumptions not only led him to misjudge Alexander, but also forced him to confront his own flaws in the most public and humbling way possible. Real change starts with self-awareness. The next time we find ourselves rushing to judge someone based on their looks, their status, or our preconceived notions, let this story remind us: strength isn't always loud, and the most powerful people are often the ones who don't need to prove it.